As global consumption grows, the environmental impacts of extraction and processing of key metals and minerals are projected to at least double between now and 2060, again, if appropriate actions are not taken. So one follows the other. Now, as you can see, we face enormous challenges. We need to meet the increasing demand for materials, yes. We need to support sustainable and inclusive growth, yes, all while ensuring that the environmental impacts are kept in check. Now, in spite of the overwhelming evidence, many governments are continuing to support fossil fuels. Our report on fossil fuel subsidies shows that the downward trend in support of fossil fuels was actually reversed in 2017. We're going backwards, just like emissions. They're growing. Subsidies actually increased by 5% in 2017, reaching $340 billion. So the costs of air pollution are enormous. Serious impact on human health, on the environment. It's crucial that we ensure that regions and cities that depend on fossil fuels and on mining and extractive industries are not left behind in the green transition. These regions and cities are the engines of growth and sometimes the only source of employment. But they do not necessarily reap the full benefits of the extraction of non-renewable resources. On the contrary, they often face challenges like limited economic diversification, pressures on community infrastructure and services, land use conflicts. So some regions have the potential to flourish due to a growing market for metals needed for renewable energy, including hydro, wind, solar power. Others remain markedly dependent on the extraction of hydrocarbons, and we need to manage significant structural adjustment costs.
Could we get at least the energy and industrial system of the world, our focus is on that rather than agriculture and land use, could we at least get that part of the total system to net zero by 2050? And our answer is an absolutely equivocal yes, unequivocal yes. It is technically and economically feasible for the global economy to reach by 2050 net zero carbon emissions from the energy and industrial systems without relying on offsets from land use. And we set that out in a report which we produced in December last year called Mission Possible. And indeed, I've just come back from China overnight from Shanghai and before that from Beijing, where we have launched a report on China 2050, China 2050, a fully developed, rich, zero-carbon economy, where we argue that China could achieve net zero emissions by 2050 while becoming a fully developed, rich economy with GDP per capita similar to, or indeed a little bit above, current Western European levels, which is the strategic objective of the Chinese government. The decarbonised route is eventually going to be cheaper than the fossil fuel route. We are soon going to reach the stage, for instance, in India, where solar plus batteries outbids coal as a way of providing new expansion of electricity supply. But the challenge is that even if we decarbonize the electricity sector and electrify all the sectors of the economy which seem obvious how to electrify, like light-duty road, we are left with what we call the hard-to-abate sectors of the economy. And these are some long-distance transport sectors like trucking, aviation and shipping, which we won't talk about today, and they are the heavy industry sectors like steel and cement and petrochemicals and aluminium. And if you add up the emissions from those really quite hard-to-abate sectors of the economy, they amount to about 30%, 10 gigatons of CO2 emissions today. But on almost any scenario, if we don't do something quite radical, they are going to increase in absolute terms and as a proportion of the total. They can reduce their emissions by 30% by 2030 by just thinking through every single step of the process and squeezing out energy efficiency improvements there. So it's important that we do that. It's also important, and particularly important, in these heavy industrial sectors that we focus on reducing the demand for carbon-intensive products and services. Because there is huge opportunity, we believe as much as 40% opportunity, to take business as usual forecasts for demand and therefore for emissions, and to reduce that simply by using these materials in a more efficient fashion. In plastics, we should and we could move to an almost completely recycled circular system. In steel, we have opportunities to increase the already high level of circulation. But in buildings, we have huge opportunities to just build buildings more intelligently. Build them with less steel and, in particular, less cement and concrete. Across the world now, cement and concrete is not a big enough part of the end cost of making a building to force architects and engineers to think about how to minimize it. So we actually pour a lot of completely unnecessary concrete. And there is a huge opportunity, particularly in Africa and India, which have not yet gone through the urbanization wave that China has gone through, to make sure that we build cities smart and low carbon first time round. That's a hugely important part of the story. But however much we do on the circular economy or on efficiency, we'll still be left with quite a lot of emissions. And so we need also to look at radically different ways of doing the whole production process. But the good news is that across each of these sectors that we've been looking at, cement, steel, and plastics, we know already ways to produce these in a zero carbon fashion.
We have decided to host the P4G summit following the first one hosted by Denmark last October. We hope that the 2020 P4G summit will be another significant event that could contribute towards and become a stepping stone in running up to COP26 in Glasgow next year. As you can see from the Korean experience, the shift towards a low-carbon economy will both pose challenges and opportunities for the governments and industries alike.
Greenhouse gas emissions are projected to double, as I was saying. And let me give you three headlines of these numbers that appears in the depicted growth. First, 12% of total greenhouse gas emissions will be associated with 7 key metals: iron, aluminum, copper, lead, manganese, nickel, and zinc. 12% of total greenhouse gas emissions will be linked to concrete production. So the construction sector is a strong driver of this increase. And greenhouse gas emissions related to materials management will increase by 50 gigatons between today and 2060.
I agree with all of you that with the importance of the carbon pricing, it's essential, I think. I would also like to call for a holistic view regards to policy, and that you also work together with the business when putting down policy, so that we can find the solutions together. And I also want to point out the need for support for research and innovation, because there are a big transition we have ahead.
On the hard-to-abate industry, you said, Lord Turner, earlier that they had been protected in Europe, for instance. We have to remember that hard-to-abate industries are low margins industries. And if we want to be successful on the 2 degrees C or 1.5 degrees C journey, we will have to ask them to take more and more technological risks and become early adopters of new technologies. And when you are low margin, you are not a risk taker. And therefore, we have to set up and imagine regulations which will enable these industries to be incentivized to become early adopters and be protected against the risks they will be taking.